James Garner, who had been holding a harsh truth for decades, eventually came out at the age of 85. It had nothing to do with celebrity, wealth, or even Hollywood politics. It was about Doris Day, a woman who was loved by everyone. Even his closest friends were taken aback by what he stated about her. Few couples were able to light up the silver screen like James Garner and Doris Day did in the early 1960s. In movies like The Thrill of It All and Move Over, Darling, audiences were enamored with their witty repartee, flirty banter, and captivating chemistry. Their glitz, charisma, and apparent synchronization made them the ideal couple for light-hearted romantic comedies. However, the reality behind the scenes was much less polished, even though the public loved them together. Some members of the team whispered even while filming that the two stars' relationship was not as warm as the final edits indicated. Garner had a reputation for being straightforward, unpretentious, and unimpressed by Hollywood gimmicks. In contrast, Doris Day was America's sweetheart, a meticulously manicured persona that, as Garner himself admits, did not always correspond with her behavior in front of the camera. Their backgrounds were diverse within the industry. Garner. Day, the wholesome box office darling fashioned by studios who required her to be flawless at all times, and the tough TV personality who became a starring guy. Garner would subsequently imply that working with Day was anything but exciting, despite the fact that their first collaboration, The Thrill of It All, was a commercial triumph. Years later, when questioned about her in interviews, he would smile graciously and offer well-chosen praise, but his secret notebooks revealed otherwise. There were repeated allusions to what he dubbed Day's deliberate charm, and he made a note of instances on set that annoyed him. She knows how to obtain what she wants and when to act innocent, according to one particularly telling entry from the era. That's the risky part. The picture that Hollywood attempted to convey through press tours and commercial images is far more complicated than that sentence alone. The fact that Garner frequently brought up Day in his writings, as though something about that collaboration had affected him more profoundly than he would have cared to acknowledge, is even more telling. Constantly conscious of how the public would perceive them, studio management supported the notion that Garner and Day were close friends. To increase ticket sales, they staged light-hearted interviews, posed them together offset, and capitalized on their chemistry. It worked for a time. However, Garner's silence on Day became increasingly apparent as the years passed. Garner's name was noticeably missing from the co-stars and directors' reflections on their collaborations. In turn, he seldom ever mentioned her until asked. Even then, he gave brief, rather clinical compliments. What specifically went wrong in their relationship? What caused a man who was friendly with almost everyone in Hollywood to become so aloof toward Doris Day? Those close to Garner said that it all started with a single day on set, a single moment that would leave him feeling caught off guard and ultimately deceived. And everything that followed would be influenced by what transpired in that instant. Things took a drastic turn when Move Over Darling was being filmed. Ever the professional, James Garner insisted on performing the majority of his own stunts. He thought it made his performances more genuine, and had established a reputation for being prepared to risk everything for a good idea. However, one scene in particular tested that reputation to its breaking point and revealed a side of Doris Day that he would never forget. Garner had to execute a physical prank in the sequence that included a bathtub, a slick floor, and an awkward fall. It was standard slapstick romantic comedy on paper. It was actually far more deadly than anyone had thought. Garner dislocated his shoulder and tore ligaments when he slipped more forcefully than he meant to and landed awkwardly during the shot. Production stopped, cameras were cut, and the crew hurried in. However, it was not the injury itself that stayed with Garner the most. It was the response of Doris Day. Day little moved, according to several set reports. As crew people fumbled about the fallen actor, she stood there, aloof and uninterested. She turned away, according to some. According to others, she only watched with a gaze that Garner would later characterize as aloof. Garner was surprised, but no one knew for certain what she was thinking at the time. He said he was expecting a quick check-in, a sign of care, or something, but it never materialized. Garner described the incident with remarkable clarity later in his autobiography. Pained and unable to move my shoulder, I lay on the floor. And I recall Doris simply standing there when I looked up. She had nothing in her eyes. Don't worry. No response. Words could never express how much that told me. More than any gossip column or tabloid story, that sentence demonstrated the extent of the hurt. Years later, Day was questioned about the incident in interviews. As usual, she dismissed it with a laugh, claiming that Garner was a tough person. Garner, however, never shrugged it off. He needed physical therapy for months after missing a few days of filming. Eventually, his body's pain subsided. However, he claims that the injury to his pride, and more significantly, to his opinion of Doris Day, never materialized. According to some insiders, Day froze in the moment because she was just overwhelmed. Others surmised that she was simply trying to get through the day since she was annoyed by the long hours. Garner, however, thought it was something else. Something colder. He sensed she didn't view the situation as a crisis, but rather as an annoyance. And there was no turning back once he came to that conclusion. They interacted politely but cautiously after that day. When the director shouted, "Cut," the gap between them was evident, despite the fact that the warmth that viewers trusted was meticulously preserved for the cameras. Garner, who had always taken great satisfaction in being a pleasure to deal with, started to distance himself. He retained the memory of that quiet for decades, even though he never spoke to her directly about it. It marked a sea change in Garner's perception of Day as a person as well as in their working relationship. He would subsequently claim that the incident taught him exactly who she was, despite the fact that he never made a big deal out of it or started a contentious interview. And from that point on, that belief would influence every choice he made about her. Following the triumph of their initial two collaborations, studios were keen to reunite James Garner and Doris Day. The audience adored them, as seen by their box office performance, and their combined identities all but assured a hit. However, one eagerly awaited project would never be completed. Additionally, what transpired behind the scenes caused a rift between them that never went away. Production was underway and Garner had already signed on when it was announced that Doris Day had abruptly left. Garner was caught off guard by the sudden and silent withdrawal, which came with no prior notice or explanation. According to reports, he had pushed Day for the part because he thought their previous connection would help the movie succeed again. There was more to her abrupt departure than a scheduling conflict. It was intimate. According to production insiders, Garner was furious. He was ashamed. Someone he believed he could at least rely on professionally left him in the dark. To make matters worse, there were allegations that Day had signed a secret contract with a different studio for a solo movie that conflicted with the one Garner had agreed to. The outcome was the same whether it was an effort to avoid working with him again or a greater salary. The bag was left in Garner's grasp. He eventually acknowledged that the quiet was what hurt the most. No explanation, no apology, no phone call. Simply a silent departure, as though the movie and his participation were completely pointless. According to friends, he interpreted the move as a direct indication that Day no longer desired to interact with him and took it personally. Garner allegedly started rejecting scripts with her name on them after that. That was not something he wanted to experience again. None of this was known to the public for years. The press blamed artistic disputes for the film's covert cancellation. However, the consequences was serious behind the scenes. Garner further distanced himself from Day, and although he maintained his civility in public, his private remarks revealed a very different picture. Decades later, Garner gave a succinct and direct reaction when asked if he would ever collaborate with her again. Once was sufficient. That wordless refusal signaled the end of the line, and it was a loaded response from a man who rarely spoke in absolutes. Doris Day's autobiography, a glossy, best-selling memoir that depicted her life in gentle pastels, was published in 1976. Its sweetness and vulnerability were acclaimed by fans, and for many, it was the closest they had ever been to meeting the genuine Doris. She talked about her difficult marriages, her upbringing, and the demands of celebrity. Although the material was selective, the tone was open. In James Garner's opinion, the book stated more about what it omitted than what it disclosed. Day made barely cursory reference to Garner in over 300 pages. Just a few complimentary remarks on what a pleasure it was to work with him. No shared memories, no stories, no indication of their underlying bond or tension from the past. The absence was startling for someone who played her opposite in two of her best-selling movies. And that seemed like a purposeful erasure to Garner. In private, he was angry. He had anticipated that the years they spent together on set, the highs and lows, and everything in between, would at least be acknowledged to some extent. Instead, he seemed to have been completely removed from her story. He felt insulted, even ridiculed, by her lack of space, according to those close to him. She was now but a footnote to a man who had been instrumental in two of her most famous performances. According to Garner, the book was full of fond memories of her co-stars, including Rock Hudson, Cary Grant, and even those lesser-known actors who had only collaborated with her once. Garner wasn't simply left out. That very absence was what picked him apart. It was more than what she didn't say. Instead, it was about whom she decided to speak. Garner appreciated honesty, but he wasn't one to seek attention. He felt that tales were to be recounted in all their untidiness. Not just the features that gave someone a nice appearance. He believed that Day's biography was meticulously chosen, molded to maintain a public persona that left little space for uncomfortable realities. By subtly deleting the passages that did not match her meticulously crafted portrayal, she had, in his opinion, taken charge of the story. In contrast, Garner wrote a chapter on his time working with Day in his own memoirs, which was published years later. It was brutally honest, but not bitter. Although he stated their relationship off camera was tense, courteous, and primarily professional, he described their on-screen chemistry as genuine. He noted that when they were alone together, he never really understood her and that something always felt a little off. There was only unresolved tension that hung there like an unanswered question, not malice. The glaring disparity between their two narratives only served to widen the gap. Day's book was praised by her supporters, but Garner's remarks were startling and unexpected, like a soft thunderclap. It was perceived by some as a last jab. Others regarded it as a man who, after years of maintaining appearances, was finally speaking the truth. However, it was more than that to those who understood how he had carried that quiet for decades. It was genuine closure, although a little late. And it was obvious to those who could read between the lines. Doris Day, Garner thought, had changed history and excluded him. Furthermore, it was impossible to go back after history had been altered. Silence frequently spoke louder than scandal in vintage Hollywood. Additionally, the silence of their common acquaintances in the instance of James Garner and Doris Day spoke for itself. It was uncommon for directors, producers, and actors who had collaborated with both stars to discuss their relationship. It was more than just a matter of deference. The reason for this was that no one wanted to become involved in something they did not fully comprehend. One of Day's best friends, Rock Hudson, was especially silent whenever Garner's name was mentioned. He was frequently seen as the link between their two worlds and had worked with both stars, but he never provided an explanation for what went wrong. Only rumors were stoked by that silence. Some others thought Hudson was more knowledgeable than he admitted, particularly regarding off-camera conflicts that were never reported by the tabloids. Other members of Day's circle did the same. When reminiscing, directors who had worked on her films praised her warmth and charm in glowing remarks, neatly excluding Garner. Garner, who was renowned for his candor, decided to exercise restraint. That was telling enough on its own. His tone changed with Doris, but he would say what he wanted about almost everyone else in Hollywood. Yes, there was annoyance, but there was also something more substantial, disappointment, or even melancholy. Rumors began to circulate over time. Some conjectured that the conflict between Garner and Day might have stemmed from more than just a lost relationship, a hidden disagreement, a broken promise, or a professional falling out. Even years after they had ceased collaborating, people close to both stars acknowledged that the energy connecting them was complex, though no one could be sure. The manner on which Day was still observed in Hollywood was another factor that contributed to the mystery. As one of the last great icons of a bygone period, she received several honors and accolades. Garner never voiced his disapproval in public, but according to sources, he was annoyed by how she seemed to get away with it. According to one of Garner's friends, she could charm the entire world, but Jim was never won over by that appeal. Day was untouchable in the court of popular opinion. Meanwhile, Garner was burdened by an unsolved past that no one wanted to discuss. He also never gave up the notion that something significant had been left unsaid between them and that stillness would persist until the very end, even though he never attempted to break her down. James Garner remained a renowned Hollywood figure over the years, quiet in retirement, graceful in aging, and adored by admirers who recalled him as a leading man who never followed the rules. He mostly avoided the limelight, preferring to spend his final years in seclusion. However, at the age of 85, Garner finally spoke about the one name that had plagued his legacy for decades, Doris Day, in an interview that few anticipated and even fewer were ready for. It was not intended to be a confessional interview. It started off as a retrospective, a look back at a career filled with legend. However, the interviewer brought up Day seemingly in passing when the topic shifted to the heyday of romantic comedies. Garner was silent for a moment. Then he sighed and uttered something that would surprise even his closest friends and family. "I never really let her go." It wasn't an angry statement. It was silent, introspective, and almost depressing. Forgiveness, according to Garner, has never been about the onset injuries, the postponed movie, or even the removal of her memoir. It was a betrayal of trust, something more profound. He claimed that although she was aware of what she'd done, she never once acknowledged it. Not a word, not even a phone call. He acknowledged that he had harbored the bitterness for longer than necessary and that it had persisted due to disappointment rather than hatred. He said, "We had an opportunity to be something amazing. Perhaps even off it, not just on the screen. But I was never able to find out why she shut that door." The interviewer was caught off guard by the confession. This was not the flaming feud journalists loved to dramatize, nor was it the usual Hollywood resentment. It was something quieter and colder, a wound that had never healed because its perpetrator had never admitted its existence. Fans and other actors were moved by Garner's remarks. Day was defended by several, who insisted that she must have had good cause. Others understood Garner's feelings of desertion and saw in his comments a lifetime of repression. However, the revelation was never intended to spark a conflict. It was merely the truth as he saw it from a guy nearing the end of his life. Long after the interview was over, his last statement about the subject was still in the air. "Occasionally, the most hurtful people are the ones you least expect." And neither of them could have fixed things by then since it was too late. When Doris Day died in 2019, people from all over the world paid their respects. She was regarded as a shining star, a classic voice, and a symbol of the heyday of Hollywood. Her passing evoked feelings of respect and longing. However, it left an unfinished story that would never be concluded for James Garner, who had died only a few years previously. Despite being quiet, Garner's revelation had illuminated their legacy. In an effort to spot any hints of stress, fans started to replay their movies, pondering the true story behind those lighthearted grins and well-timed jokes. However, all of the hurt, miscommunication, and animosity that had been between them perished with them. No letter would be found, no apology would be made, and no last-minute reconciliation would take place. The door was permanently shut. Film historians and biographers have attempted to reconstruct what went wrong in the years since. The rift, according to others, was professional. Others believe it was personal, possibly romantic, something more sensitive that neither star ever wanted to talk about in public, and that it sprang from conflicting personalities and unacknowledged egos. However, the reality is still obscure. Garner's following remarks were never addressed by Doris Day. Whether she ever heard them at all is unknown. In her later years, she had become renownedly quiet, rarely speaking in public and concentrating mostly on her work as an animal advocate. Garner had already disappeared from the public eye by the time she did open up. She never expressed any regrets, if she had any. Thus, the mystery still stands. A legacy as brilliant as it is unfinished was left by two of Hollywood's biggest stars, who will always be connected by two iconic movies and decades of conjecture. They had genuine on-screen chemistry. There is no question about that. A more eerie tale of lost opportunities, damaged pride, and a stillness that spoke louder than any screenplay is told from the distance behind the curtain. Maybe it was not about blame after all. Maybe it was about two people who were molded by a profession that pushed for false grins, stillness in the face of suffering, and perfection. Millions of people were delighted by what they displayed on TV, but what they chose not to say conveys a very different and possibly unfathomable tale. Perhaps the most human aspect of all is that